Ooh, it works. Perfect. Okay. This is for the slides. All right. Perfect. Thank you very much for the organizers, for the audience, for everybody to show up for this small presentation in which we're going to talk about social credit, China, surveillance, and other things. I always start this presentation by asking, who's heard of social credit before? So people who've heard of it, please raise your hand. Okay, yeah. How many of you heard about an idea of social sorting or scores that people would get? Like scores, yeah, like, okay. All right, okay, well, that's good. There's some background. But first, I'll talk about myself for like approximately 20 seconds. I started to work on social credit a couple of years ago when I was still doing my master's degree. Then I created my own company, research company on China, and worked with a couple of independent think tanks. I worked 2 years during COVID at the French embassy in Beijing when I was like in charge of science and technology. And since 2022, I am now a PhD student at the University of Vienna. So, what are we going to talk about today? I think I want you to have 3 takeaways. So first, to understand where the social credit comes from. Second, to understand what it actually is. And maybe later we'll discuss a little bit of why did the Chinese states build this. So, I always have this slide because if you're interested in tech or in just politics in general, the discourse about China is often a little bit caricatural. There's this paradox that I really like, that is Schrödinger China, that it's strong enough to take over the world at any moment, and yet, you know, the economy is about to crumble, and the Communist Party is going to lose, and China is going to collapse at every moment. Of course, the idea is that today we're going to go a little bit after this discourse, and if we kind of try to discuss our assumptions about social credit, well, we see that there's a lot of ideas that might be wrong. So I asked this question before. Social credit is often used as the example of digital totalitarianism. That's it. That's 21st century dictatorship. Social credit would be the best example of it. It's kind of the Black Mirror idea of a score that would dictate your position in society. If you cross the street at a red light, then you're going to lose your social security benefits. It's really, with social credit, the idea of like the high-tech AI-enabled surveillance that, well, you know, China would be building. Obviously, as Flavor Flav would say, don't believe the hype, this is mostly wrong. So, as a disclaimer, and we're going to talk about this later, I'm not saying that there is no surveillance in China. Like, I mean, obviously there is, and I would be happy to take question about it. What I'm going to first say is that social credit is actually not so much about surveillance, and I'm going to show you why. So yeah, let's do a little bit of history and try to understand where does social credit come from. Maybe just a side note on what actually social credit means, because there is a reason why nobody understands what it means, and actually, like even in Chinese, like the term social credit doesn't mean anything. It's literally composed of the word social and credit, and it's usually associated with a couple of words that you will see a lot in the propaganda, like sincerity or keeping one's promise, or like honesty in general. So that is the notions that the word conveys in Chinese, at least. So yeah. A small slide to have a bit of background. So, I don't know how familiar you are with Chinese history, but basically Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and starting in 1978, there is a discussion about how we're going to modernize the country. Shifting away from the Maoist communism to something more maybe capitalistic, or at least more modern, to develop and build an industry in China. So, at the same time, in the 80s, there is an intellectual movement that takes interest into information revolution. Alvin Toffler, that might not be the best scientist ever, but he was extremely popular in China. Cybernetics was also quite entrenched. You had people like Qian Xuesen, who was the leading scholar in charge of the nuclear bomb and space system in China, was also a fervent cybernetic researcher. They tried to build programs that would use the principle of cybernetics to modernize the country. Actually, the famous one-child policy is directly inspired by cybernetic principles. So yeah, when after 20 years, roughly, of economic development of capitalism, market economy, Chinese political elites, corporate executive and academics starts to witness a couple of problems popping up. Frauds. People don't pay their debt. Companies would not respect their legal obligations. Like there would be a perceived loss of moral values, of political values. Right? So that kind of triggers an anxiety in the society, an idea that, wait, like this is really, well, everything is going bad nowadays. You know, like with capitalism, this is getting terrible. We need to act on it. And this is how the idea of having a social credit comes from. Because they were like, okay, we are faced with economic and financial problem, so maybe we should build a commercial rating system, like you have in the US, like you have to some extent in Europe, like not how do you call it, like financial rating companies, credit, like also investigation company, like Equifax in the US. They wanted to have this kind of company in China, so this company could investigate and you know, like maybe track people with good financial records. And at the same time, the state also got interested in this idea because from the government point of view, there was an idea that was very attractive that was to build digital registries, databases of information, of companies, of individuals that would kind of keep track of everybody and kind of know what's going on the economy. So that leads to the first time we have a document about social credits in 2001. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but what you have to remember at the time is that in 2001, the government say, okay, we need to have two mechanisms. One that will be basically propaganda, education, teaching people that respecting the value of integrity is important. And on the other hand, what they call credit mechanisms, which are blacklist and red list, that is tools to give incentives to people. After this, and again, I'm not going to make a lot of details, like from 2001 to 2014, there is 13 years of development. You might have heard about scoring. Before I ask, there is a couple of famous experiments in the 2000s, especially one in the city of Sutian, in which the city government tried to categorize people into categories going from A to D based on their civic behavior. No need to say, even by Chinese standards, this was horrible, like this was a bad idea. So this experiment was cancelled because they were like, no, you cannot put citizens into categories. But yeah, summary of this history part, what I want you to remember today is that like social credit is something that dates back the 1990s. That like it is actually it talks about many different ideas of financial integrity, of economic regulation and politics all into this, under this weird word that is social credit. And it took a very long time to develop. So now we're going to go to the meat of it, what it is social credit nowadays. In 2014, the government published this famous outline about building a social credit system. There's three things in this outline. First, you're not going to be surprised, is building a financial industry. Okay, nothing weird here. Second, deployment of social credit infrastructures. I'm going to come to this into more details, but basically building database to store government information at every level of the state. That would mean national level, the province, like the big province of China, the big cities should have their one, and also like district or like local governments should also have this kind of databases. I'm going to give you a concrete example of this later. And finally, use the credit mechanisms in all areas. So these credit mechanisms, I gave you like a small hint. On one hand, it's a lot of education, and on the other hand is this so-called blacklist and red list. You will have a very clear example of this a bit later. So yeah, this is a very simplified view of what would social credit be. So under this idea of a social credit system, you actually have two things. That's very important, I would like you to remember. On the one hand, you have like a private, or actually non-state, credit reporting industry that would develop private credit reporting or scoring mechanism. For those who have been in China, we're familiar to it. There's the idea of the Sesame credit by the company Alipay, ex-subsidiary of Alibaba. This is actually a private program and is more like a loyalty reward scheme. Then on the other hand, you have what the government does. And this is two things, two main simplified mechanisms. On the one hand, building information sharing platforms. That is, well, you know, government database, government cloud, whatever, how you would call it. And on the other hand, what we call in political science policy instruments, that is tools. In this case, this so-called blacklist and red list system. So yeah, I want to give you like a very quick dive on social credit infrastructure because I think this is actually maybe the most important part of social credit. Well, this is an academic definition. You don't have to go through it. Basically, is that you can view social credit as being an attempt by the state to build these digital infrastructures that would allow the state, the government, to share and use, and use this information on companies, individuals, and non-governmental associations. Practically speaking, these are 4 examples of this. I mean, this is the user aspect, of course. This is not like the back end, the actual infrastructure, but this is just a screenshot of 4 of these government platforms that allows you to check information on companies in this case. I mean, on the first one, it's individual, the Supreme Court, that's the most famous blacklist. I'm sure I'm going to have questions on this. If you're on this blacklist, it means that you didn't pay your debt and you might be forbidden to take planes or trains. I use might for some reasons. So yeah, that's the one from the Supreme Court. This is like a random company that is a clinic in Jiangsu that apparently has a pretty good economic score. This is the Ministry of Social Affairs. On this platform, I can look for any NGOs in China. And this is another platform that has been built by the State Administration for Market Regulation. There are countless more of these. And that has important consequences that we'll talk about later. But for example, the National Credit Information Database, which is the most important database in the country, the one that is supposed to aggregate all the information. This actually is built in a collaborative way. This is kind of interesting. It's like, well, the Chinese state will subcontract company to build it. So without going into too much details, because this is a bit unnecessary, but for building this thing, they contracted 29 different companies. At the local level, it's kind of the same idea, because if you have the city of, I don't know, the city of, well, like there's 2 examples, Luzhou or Hengyang or whatever smaller cities in China, they also have to build a database. So what do? Well, they will also either subcontract it to different companies, or, and that is what I think always is interesting in China, they would maybe give a very good amount of money to a local company that belongs to the state. So, you just give money to yourself. That's a good idea to always build databases. But anyway, I'm skipping to this a little bit. Some figures about these platforms, this databases that's been built. It cost around 500 million euros since 2013, and these figures are for sure incomplete, but that is quite a lot of money when you think of it for a government program. And the database I showed you before, the one that was like from the State Market Administration, actually cost only 30 million euros. So this is to say that this is actually big money, and so big potential for corruption as well. But we'll come back to this later. Anyway, I went on this infrastructure aspect for a little bit because I want to show you that in the case of social credit, we're not talking about like AI, face recognition, whatever. We're talking about boring database construction, but at a large scale. At a very large scale, at China scale. And this is quite most likely the most important thing about social credit. Because now we're going to talk about the credit mechanism, so like this kind of thief, the thing that you've been all maybe waiting for. First, and it's the most boring one, is like a lot of social credit, maybe probably the most of it, a lot of social credit activity would be in the form of just good old posters printed in the village. That is, this is actually a board that is telling them how do you get points depending on what behaviors in this village. So I went through it, and it's, for example, yeah, there is no negative point on this one. It's either you gain point or you don't have them. But for example, don't leave your trash in front of your house. Clean the front of your house. Make sure that like you don't have your animals, because it's in the countryside, your cows or pigs or whatever, that just like are free in the village. So this is actually a lot of social credit thing. It's trying to tell people, hey, behave in a certain, I don't know, state-controlled, civilized way. But this is actually the main coercive element of social credit, the so-called blacklist and red list. Actually, there's a lot of blacklist, and the principle is always the same. It's like when you broke a law, you didn't pay back your debt, you cheated on the social security contribution, your company has been throwing wastewater in the local river, a court finds that you're guilty, but the judgment, like you don't care, that you just don't respect the judgment, then they're going to blacklist you. That's the principle of how it works. The thing is, this has very different realities around in the country. This is a very good study that was made a couple of years ago that is just showing what are on this blacklist in 4 different cities in the country. So Hangzhou is a very big city that is the city of Alibaba. Fuzhou is another city south like in Fujian. Zhuhai is near Shenzhen. And Hefei is like a more inland city that is more like lower tier. What's interesting is that you see that in these 3 countries, like these 3 cities, you have like very different things that are in blacklist. Like for example, in Hangzhou, you have 30% of the entries on the blacklist would be individual, but in the rest of the country, it's less than 1 person. It really depends what are the local priorities. If we look at Hangzhou, the main reason to be on the blacklist is, well, because you failed to cancel the registration of your car. But then if you look at Hefei, nearly like probably more than 80% of the entries are actually Ubers that have not been properly registered. So this is why you would be on a blacklist, because you're the Uber driver company, but you're actually not properly registered with the state, so they would put you on a blacklist. Another 4,000 entries in Hefei is because you went too fast on the highway. So this is, you see, like this is actual entries, and we're very far from kind of AI-enabled surveillance. This is like very trivial stuff. But this is actually the most of the entries. Then again, at the country level, different province build the system in a very different way. This is the number of blacklists per province, and you can see that, well, some areas take the work much more seriously. Like for example, like Qinghai, which is a province in northern Tibet that has maybe maximum 20 million people, has 22 different blacklists, when Hebei, which is one of the biggest, most populated provinces of the country, has only 1. So it really is not a kind of one-size-fits-all thing that the whole state is going to control everywhere the same. It's actually very localized and very different. Same goes with the red list. The red list are the same thing that the black list, but simply like it's for rewards. If you're on the red list, it's because you're a good citizen. So it's the same principle. But like again, it's very different in different parts of the country. It doesn't work to say it's like not a one-size-fits-all. So yeah, this was an important thing again that I want you to remember, is that so what we call the teeth of social credit, or the carrot and sticks, is what we call credit mechanism. And there are 2 of them mostly. This propaganda effort, kind of like posters saying that you should be a good citizen and be careful with your trash. And second, that the blacklist and red list. And remember, this is not the one-size-fits-all. It's different in the whole country. But okay, now we have like around 7 minutes, and I'm not going to need as much to discuss why do we actually need a social credit system. Why would the Chinese government build this stuff? I talked about it before, and as I said, social credit is not per se about surveillance. Now, sure, there is a whole strand of academic literature that say that pretty much everything is surveillance. Like taking the subway with a smart card is surveillance because the subway companies know where you're going. The thing is, why would I say that social credit is not about surveillance? And just because the state doesn't need social credit to just spy on everybody and put the people they don't like in jail. They don't need this. Like, they have people to do that. They have the Public Security Bureau or the State Security Bureau with employees like hundreds of thousands of people. They have like actual AI, facial recognition cameras in different parts of the countries. Like, you don't need social credit in China to repress the people you don't like. So this is a different thing. This is not, also social credit does not include real-time surveillance of people. Like, you don't have a real-time thing on your phone that is going to tell you what you do if you jaywalk like at the red light on the street. This isn't real time. It's a really administrative system. So why then? What's the question? So first of all, I mentioned cybernetics in the beginning. You might wonder why, but the reason is because China, just like the Soviet Union, or just like the United States for different things, there's this idea of having automated regulation system as the state. That you would be a government and you know, like information would flow automatically. You will have like real-time information about company paying the taxes and whatever. This is a very attractive idea in China as well. They have this dream, kinda, if I might say so, of having a very efficient government. Also, the second part, as I mentioned, is that the administration and the bureaucracy in China is actually relatively inefficient. If I take the example of Europe, if I go to Sweden and I get a lot of debt there that I'm never repaying, I'm not going to be able to fly to Greece and just think that I can escape my debt. But in China, it's actually possible. You could do a business in the northern part of the country and kind of fail, like cheat, I don't know, swindle money from other people and just disappear in nature, go to another province. It would be extremely hard for people to find you and to actually tell you, hey, like you owe someone like 10K in this other part of the country. This is actually fairly easy. Even with all this surveillance, it's fairly easy to disappear in China. So the idea with social credit was to build this kind of database so that we can keep track of all these records. And that if a company or if a guy is doing something in some part of the country and then tries to cheat, well, we're going to be able to kind of keep track of it. And then the last part is that the state would also want to have a less heavy-handed approach to economic regulation. That is, with this database and so on, you can keep a better track of companies' behaviors, and it's not going to be relying so much of in-person inspections and things like that. So yeah, now does social credit really works? Actually, not really. It doesn't work. That's the funny thing also is I told you about this blacklist of people who are like in debt and that would not be able to go on planes and so on. Well, actually, like I personally know people who are in blacklist because they have, well, didn't pay back debt and their life is not having much problem, to be honest. Like you can always find a way out of it. Second, there is a lot of redundancy between platforms, and different state administration, different part of the government actually don't want to share data with each other. So they built all these platforms, but they kind of, many of them are sometimes empty. Like there is not so much information there because yeah, you build the platform, you pay the company, but you don't put anything up. So that is a bit of a problem. And yeah, and then as I said, the system is very fragmented. That is, that between provinces, for example, the data sharing might not work as well. But actually, it doesn't really matter. Because the reason why I insisted on infrastructure so much is that like when you think of it, the Chinese government has built over the last 10, 15 years a gigantic amount of platforms that might not work for now, but the infrastructure exists. You have servers, you have connected databases that are more or less functional all across the country. And when you think of it, it's actually quite a feat for a country the size of China. So the point is that they might not be able to know what to do or to make it work now, but the infrastructure exists. So that means that maybe in 5 or 10 years, well, that will have more positive, or I mean, positive not necessarily for individual, but from the point of the state, that will actually work in 5 years. So this is maybe the most important part. I'll conclude that very briefly, and I'll repeat the first thing. So this is not, social credit is not something that come out of the blue. There's a long history of it, conceptual history that is rooted in time. Second, the most important characteristic is that it's an infrastructure. It consists of many different administrative databases that have been built over the last 15 years. And finally, that like it produced mixed results, at least kind of working, but not really. And in the future, this infrastructure might find other use. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Do we have any questions in the room? I do believe we have time for 1, 2 quick questions. Yes, one in the front.
Tools are generally as effective as the way they are used. You talked a bit about the faults of the system, but I'd be curious if there's a general attitude or opinion about if it's the way it's used or if it's the system itself, such as like the enforcement or the amendments or the changes or the bureaucracy around it or manipulation or abuse.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and as you said, it's really how it's used and how we're using. So the Chinese state system, like the bureaucracy, how the Communist Party works, I mean, how the regime works, kind of makes that this kind of systems are, in a way, inherently flawed. Because, like, well, before you were a company, maybe you were just, like, gonna go see the local politician guy and pay him to get out of trouble. Now, in theory, they're gonna put you in a database and they're gonna tell you, oh, like, hey, like, you are a track record of you. But, like, if you know the right guy in the administration that actually manages these entries, you could still find your way out of it. And the thing is, this is a lot of this thing that you see a lot of in China. Like, I mentioned this idea of cybernetic and so on. The government thinks, or wants to think, that technology is going to solve its problem. But some of the problems of the Chinese government are structural. It's like, it is not, it's an authoritarian regime, a one-party state. That means that there is no clear, or at least entirely reliable source of information. There is incentive in the system to just make performative thing. A lot of these databases, for example, that I've done a survey in which I just went through a lot of public procurements on the database construction. For a lot of them, you see that this is fake. You see that they do it because, okay, I'm a city mayor, my boss asked me to build a social credit system. I don't really care, I don't really know what to do with it, but I have to do it. It's one of my KPI. So you just build something performatively. Then you have a database that is not used. So this is an very important point you make, is like the Chinese states, how it works, means that these kind of solutions have inherent flaws because you can't change human. You can't change the politics, how it works. So it's the same with all the surveillance thing. I mean, like one example that is actually quite dramatic, but like that shows really the flaws of social credit system. It's like in June 2022 or 3, I don't remember, there was like a violent beating of a woman in a town in northern China. Like 7 guys were like really beating her very hard, like for whatever local thing. Later on, they did some investigation and they found out that the guy was actually like the head of the local mafia. He had been 7 times blacklisted on all the blacklists possible, the one that were supposedly make him impossible to go around. But, well, he was close to the police, so like he never had any problem. So you can put as much surveillance as you want. In the end, system is the system. Like the political system is the political system. Yeah.
More questions? Yes.
Hello, thank you for the talk. You just exposed one rule before, other rules, about like don't put the trash in front of your house, stuff like that. And I'm just curious about to know who defines the rules and what happens if people who define the rules are kind of corrupt.
Yeah, so there's actually a debate in China, like for many years, that who should define what's get onto social credit system. Because the funny thing is that they can't agree. And it really depends which province or which locality, which priority they have. But there is actually a debate. The debate is, should the state, so the central government, Beijing, decide for the whole country? But then some people are like, no, because the priorities in Beijing or in Shanghai are not the same for us, my small town in the back of China. So we want to have rules that are different. For example, like as we saw with the slide that had all different entries in the blacklist, for some city it might be more relevant to punish companies that, I don't know, don't pay the wages and the worker on time. But so they're actually not clear. There is no basically uniform things that one should get in. There are, however, clear rules on what should not get on social credit. So this is clear rules. There should not be any information about like health of individuals, about their ethnicity, because in China you have 56 minority ethnicities and it's written on the card. And there should not be, in theory, anything like related to, the religion. And this is also like kind of, I say this is, well, the safeguard, so to say, but it's also very funny because it means that the state obviously has this information. And in this case, it's the public security, so the police. But the police has no interest in giving out this information to anybody else. So there's a lot of politics, inside government politics going on here. But to answer your question in one sentence, well, we have been waiting for the last, I think, 5 years for a so-called social credit law that hasn't been coming out yet, because they don't know what to do with it.
Okay, I see there's more potential for questions, but we have to continue with the program. So thank you so much, Pierre, and I guess find him around to discuss further on social credit. And we meet back here in 1 or 2 minutes.